On the phone, it's a pleasure to welcome to the program syndicated columnist and staff writer for Pando Daily, David Sirota. David, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So let's talk about this piece, "The Wolf of Sesame Street," revealing the secret corruption inside PBS's news division. Now, this is in some ways a bit of a follow-up for a report you did on the huge scam that is taking place in terms of the public pensions across the country. Let's start with John Arnold. Who is this guy?
John Arnold is a former Enron trader who pled the fifth during the Enron investigations. He was one of Enron's biggest energy speculators. His trades were involved potentially in the California energy speculation that caused so many problems in California. He was one of their most successful, I guess, for himself, traders. And he went on to recreate basically Enron in his own company after that debacle. He hired the president of Enron and a couple of other Enron folks. They reconstituted their team, and he became ultimately a billionaire. He is a guy.
That's a classic American story, isn't it? I mean, of accountability and crime doesn't pay.
That's right. I mean, it's an amazing story unto itself. What I would argue is even more amazing, and unfortunately also classically American, is that he went on from that to create a political profile for himself that seems to succeed in pushing the kinds of things at the public policy level that Enron has created in the economy. Enron blew a huge hole, for instance, in public pension holdings. Public pensions suffered great losses in the Enron debacle. John Arnold has devoted his political life, his political activism, he calls it philanthropy, to trying to cut the pension benefits for police officers, firefighters, teachers, municipal workers. He's made it his goal, his focus in the political realm for so-called pension reform. That's what he spent, according to his own numbers, at least $10 million on campaigns in state legislatures across the country to convince legislators to cut the guaranteed retirement income benefits that those public workers were promised when they negotiated originally the contracts for employment.
Now, we should also say at this point that the stories that we heard following the financial crisis of just how underfunded public pensions were and how much of a drag they were on municipalities, on states, and whatnot, was hugely a function of essentially the crash, the financial crisis, and that in many respects, to the extent that any of these pensions are underfunded, is because politicians get in there and decide we're going to provide tax cuts rather than meeting our contractual obligations.
That's right. It's been a 1-2 punch. The financial crisis harmed the returns of those pension funds that they were relying on. Meanwhile, state governments and local governments weren't making their actuarially required payments to the pension funds and instead spending that money on other things. For instance, massive corporate subsidies, tax cuts. That's effectively raiding workers' retirement benefits. I mean, the way to think about this is if you're working for a company and you agree in your, let's say, your retirement plan, your 401k, you agree to put in X amount of dollars, and your employer says, we're going to put in Y amount of dollars, or we're going to match it with Y amount of dollars. You do that for 20, 30 years, and then 20, 30 years down the road, your employer says, oh, by the way, we haven't been making our contributions. We've been using that money for executive pay packages, all sorts of wasteful things. And then the solution to that would be like your employer coming to you and saying, so we're going to have to cut your retirement benefits. You're going to have to pay for that. That's exactly what's going on in public pensions right now, and the whole debate about it, and we shouldn't misunderstand that.
And we should also say to sort of draw that analogy out, when these private companies, they underfund the pensions, they end up getting profits, and literally the CEOs and the board of directors because they're able to sort of increase their profits and cut their costs on the backs of those workers' payments that they promise them in the future, they end up getting bonuses. The analogy would be that politicians help their political careers by basically telling their constituents, we can give you these services for free, when in fact, really what's happening is that the workers are paying for those services. They just don't know it yet until they come around to their pension time. And I think your report dealt also with what was happening in Rhode Island too, if I'm not mistaken.
So that's right. That's right. And just to add to what you've said is that not only do they promise the public essentially services for free, they're also using the money that should be being put into pension funds that is actuarially required. They're using that to hand out corporate subsidies, many of which are their campaign contributors. I mean, the amount of money that state and local governments are spending each year on direct tax subsidies and handouts to corporations is much bigger than the overall pension shortfall in America. So when we talk about, and this is important to understand as we get into the discussion about PBS, when we talk about a quote-unquote pension crisis, that states are being bankrupted by pensions, what's not being mentioned is the fact that the handouts to the wealthy, those corporate subsidies, are far bigger than the pension shortfall. So it's really the you could make the argument that it's the corporate subsidies that are bankrupting the states and the localities, but that's not discussed because that's something that has a huge amount of money and power behind it. There are major campaign contributors who want those corporate subsidies to continue. And so those major business campaign contributors go to politicians and say, protect the subsidies, and the way you balance the books is to cut the pensions. That's exactly what's gone on, as you mentioned, in Rhode Island, which has become a national laboratory for this. John Arnold, the Enron mogul who we've been discussing, he funded a major political campaign in Rhode Island to gut public workers' pensions there, and also preserve $300 million a year in corporate subsidies, including that very famous one that was given to Curt Schilling,
yes,
the baseball potential Hall of Fame pitcher, who blew $75 million on his software firm. The state gave him $75 million. Boom, it went bankrupt. Goodbye. Taxpayers now on the hook for $100 million in liabilities for that. That's about $200 for every household in the state. But nobody's talking about the fact that those subsidies are bankrupting the state. What John Arnold funded in terms of his campaign in Rhode Island was a campaign to say, let's balance the books, not by getting rid of those corporate subsidies, but by cutting the promised retirement benefits of police officers, firefighters, and teachers.
And we should also add that there's also millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars that have been poured into campaigns to essentially demonize public workers. I mean, we see this across the country. It's been an ongoing project of folks like Grover Norquist and undoubtedly, guys like Arnold as well.
Absolutely. And then the other piece of this, of course, is that there's been a simultaneous move to take public pension money investments, the money that's already in there, and to move them into high-fee investments on Wall Street for hedge funders. I mean, there has been this push. Wall Street has contributed big money to politicians to get them to, in their discretion of where the actual pension holdings are invested, to invest them into hedge funds that create massive fees that don't get a return, of course, for the pensioner, but do generate a huge amount of profits for Wall Street.
But the good news is that we don't just have to rely on people like yourself to tell us the story. We have public broadcasting in this country, which surely must be delving into what's going on with these pensions and telling us this story. Or maybe I don't have that exactly right.
Yeah, well, Sam, I'm glad you bring up PBS. Right, PBS is supposed to be a place where one of the last places that you can rely on for impartial reporting on a very serious issue like this. And that's where what happened about a week and a half ago was exposed. John Arnold, who has been funding this major campaign across the country to demonize public workers and cut public pensions, it was revealed that John Arnold was funding public broadcasting's national public pension series called, quote-unquote, the pension peril. Now, we've just discussed why that is a unto itself a tilted view of what's going on in state budgets and local budgets. It's basically blaming pensions for state budget problems. It's the pensions are creating the peril. John Arnold, who is
and we should say at this point that you could have done a series like The Peril of Old Age in an era of diminished pensions, which would be far more apropos.
You could have done subsidy peril. You could have done, a tax cut peril. But instead, the program that was embedded into the PBS NewsHour was called the pension peril. And what came out of about a week and a half ago was that John Arnold, who has been actively campaigning to cut pensions in state legislatures, is the single funder of that series. And that PBS actually went to him, knowing his interest in public pension activism. They went to him to solicit his money for this very program. They tailored the program idea to him. Now, what's the problem with this? Well, there's obviously many problems. First and foremost, it violates major rules in PBS unto itself. PBS has all sorts of rules that say that a politically active funder on a set issues cannot be funding directly programming that is directly related to what they are doing in the political arena. They can make general grants, but you can't fund a specific program about the very political activism that you are engaged in. So that it violates that issue. I mean, there's all sorts of other rules that it violates, but the point is it's an ethical issue, especially when you consider the fact, and here's the kicker, when PBS was airing these spots, it looked like news, and there was no explicit disclosure to viewers that John Arnold was funding this. Here's the example that blows people's minds.
Now, hold on.
Before
we get there, we should say there are such things where a funder funds a segment wherein their opinion is broadcast. We call them advertisements, essentially, or info ads. But all right, wait. Let's back up just a minute. Just if you were just a viewer of PBS, what would you have seen, and beginning when? What would you have seen?
So what you would have seen is you would have tuned into the NewsHour on the segments aired to begin on the weekend NewsHour. You would have tuned in. If you caught the beginning of the show, I'm talking about the very beginning of the entire broadcast. In a long list of funders, you may have seen the Laura and John Arnold Foundation listed as a funder of the entire show. Then you would have watched the show, and then about 15 minutes in, you would have seen the anchor introduce the ongoing series called The Pension Peril. And you would see a segment about why pensions are effectively, supposedly, bankrupting states and localities. You would not have been told that John Arnold and the Laura and John Arnold Foundation funded specifically the Pension Peril series. There would have been no disclosure of that. And there would have been no disclosure, this is incredible, of John Arnold's involvement in the very issues that the Pension Peril series were covering. Here's the example. They covered, at one point, a proposal in California, a California proposed ballot initiative to allow municipalities to severely cut public pensions, to essentially unilaterally cut them and free them of state laws that bar them from doing that right now. What the Pension Peril series didn't mention is not only was the Pension Peril series funded by John Arnold, who was generally an active campaigner against these pension benefits, but that John Arnold is financing the very ballot initiative in California that the show was covering. You would have been told none of it.
This is just so mind-boggling. Such a corruption of, to me, it goes even just beyond the notion of any type of like policies that PBS would have. I mean, this is just, we wouldn't even, I can't even imagine it's almost like I'm even trying to contemplate this on a national news level. I mean, the closest thing that we had would be sort of like one of those sort of ready-made press kits that the Defense Department would put out during the Iraq War, and just running the whole thing and saying, not even acknowledging that's where you get it from. I mean, this is really it's just stunning. So how long was the Pension Peril series running for?
Well, it was running. It was announced. It was announced in late November on PBS's website in a press release. What was weird was, and what got me somewhat onto the story was that the announcement came after 2 segments had already run. So that was already weird. What else was weird about this? And it ran basically from early November into early February until this was exposed, and PBS had to respond. And we'll get to what exactly they said. But what was interesting was what got me onto this story was the fact I looked at the press release. Okay, I looked at the press release on PBS's website. They omitted John Arnold's involvement even in the press release. So clearly, this was not some accident. Oh well, we forgot to mention it, or just one anchor who's I forgot, we didn't write it into the script. From the very beginning, they were hiding this, and that tells you that they probably knew to hide this because they knew exactly what you said, that if viewers found out about this insidious relationship, viewers would be pissed. In fact, in my story that broke this, I quoted a source who was working with PBS on a totally separate project, who somehow pension issues came up in their meeting, and she asked who is funding this Pension Peril series, and they told her, PBS officials told her, they said we are not right now disclosing the funders. So clearly they were trying to hide this.
Right. So they were aware that even if this is not just a question of disclosure. This is completely inappropriate, and so there's 2 things that are going on here. One is the inappropriate relationship they have, and the sort of the corruption of their news, and then there's basically the cover up of it.
That's exactly right. I mean, and when the story first came out, when we broke our story at Pando, which we titled "The Wolf of Sesame Street" to invoke PBS, when they at first insisted that nothing was wrong, that absolutely nothing was wrong, and that they were going to continue with the series, and that they had nothing to apologize for, and perhaps there was a perception issue, but nothing here was wrong at all. And what that really suggested, at least to me, was that not only did they do something that was wrong, not only did they know they were doing something that was wrong, thus the attempting to hide it before it was exposed, but they were then digging in to insist that they didn't have to change, and that there was not, that they could just continue this kind of thing. Now, I want to add here. Some people may be asking, well, why would PBS do this? Now, look, I think there's a lot of legitimate questions about that. I mean, who's running PBS? You've got the Koch brothers, who were involved in one of the major stations in Boston. The whole question of leadership at PBS, those are all legitimate questions. But on top of all of that, one thing that's come out about this is that, look, when we underfund our public media compared to other industrialized nations in a really, really grotesque way. I mean, we really do not adequately fund our public media. And so what we've created is the best of both worlds for conservatives and corporate interests, in the sense that PBS still has the brand of the public. It still seems kind of public-ish, because it gets some money from the taxpayers and from quote-unquote viewers like you. But the problem is that it doesn't get enough, and so that forces people in PBS to be increasingly desperate and go to people like John Arnold, asking them for money to do basic programming. I mean, that creates all sorts of ethical issues, but that's the best of both worlds for the John Arnolds of the world, right? They get to launder their radical, ideological, anti-worker agenda through the brand of supposedly nonpartisan, impartial PBS. That's PBS's unique selling proposition to somebody like John Arnold. That's how they can get him to give $3.5 million to them. They don't go to him and say, "Hey, can we have money for journalism?" He's like, "No, I don't. Why am I going to give you money for journalism? Hey, will you give us $3.5 million to launder your political message through our brand?" Now John Arnold is interested.
Right. And so is that how much? So now you found that the now this come from the foundation? I mean, that's why he considers it philanthropy, right? Like, I'm getting a tax write-off to destroy your
Oh,
pension.
absolutely.
All right, so
That's absolutely. That's
talk to us
correct.
about
Yeah.
the money end of it. It was 3.5 million earmarked specifically for this. I mean, did his foundation
Correct.
then give other money? I mean, give us the contours of this deal essentially that he made.
$3.5 million listed at the buried on the foundation's website. Although give them credit, at least they disclosed it somewhere. $3.5 million specifically for education about, and I'm putting that in quotes, education about public pension issues, which PBS confirmed was specifically earmarked for the Pension Peril series. And so this is the deal that went down. And we know those contours. Here's where it gets even more upsetting, is that when asked for the specific details of the contract between the Arnold Foundation and PBS officials and the Arnold Foundation, shocker, both refused to disclose the details of the contract. They have still refused to release the details of this contract, despite the fact that it is under the auspices of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which is a public entity, taxpayer-funded entity. So they are arguing that we are not allowed to see the details of the contract they signed. Why is that important? Well, because it goes to the question of editorial control.
Right.
Who's actually calling the shots in deciding not only whether to call the whole series Pension Peril, but to then, on a segment-to-segment basis. Arnold, one thing that I got from them was they said, look, one thing we can tell you is that in the contract we reserve the right to cut off funding under quote-unquote extraordinary circumstances. Right. AKA, that just sends a message to the people making the program. Listen, if you start doing things that John Arnold doesn't like, your funding for this on an ongoing basis may not be there.
I mean, this is basically this is the very definition of an info ad. I mean, there's really no other way. I mean, this is essentially Ron Popeil going on with the Chop-O-Mator or whatever it is, except for in this case it's John Arnold basically leasing out WNET as a production company and buying his time onto the whatever they're calling it now, the Lear Hour or the PBS News Hour.
Now, and again, you could argue that, hey, listen, if they disclose that, or even I would even go as far to say this, if it was a standalone production in, let's say, PBS's series called POV, Point of View, at least it would intimate to viewers this is one point of view.
Right.
But embedding it in the news hour without explicit disclosure is really, really unseemly. It's really unseemly, and then to not let the public see the terms of the contract just says everything that needs to be said about whether what the P in PBS really stands for. Does it really stand for public, or does it stand for something like plutocrat?
Right. And now, do you have a sense of, has that foundation provided other funds to PBS, or is this is their one-off?
This was, according to their documents, this was their one-off to WNET, and WNET is the New York flagship station that then its content is distributed throughout the PBS network. So the Pension Peril stuff, that went out to hundreds of public television stations. And I mean, Arnold has given money to he's a billionaire, so he's given a lot of money to a lot of different areas. But clearly, this was an important one. This is one of the biggest grants that his foundation gave. The funniest response from PBS, by the way, was when the PBS officials attempted initially to insist that they thought it was okay to take this money because it came from John Arnold's foundation, not directly from John Arnold, and that there's supposedly some sort of distinction between the anti-pension work of the Arnold Foundation and John Arnold's massive campaign contributions to anti-pension politicians. Obviously, they're working in tandem. It was a pretty pathetic attempt to parse the differences here.
Well, to be fair, it is called the Laura and John Arnold Foundation,
that's
not
true.
just
That's
the John Arnold Foundation. So maybe,
I want to make one other point here, because I think I got a couple of angry calls from people in PBS, shocker, and a couple of them, I think they said to me basically, look, the reporters on this, some of them didn't know about the funding, some of them had no idea, they just went out and reported, and And my response, and so their argument was, look, they, on some of the editorial staff, they weren't taking direction from or even had knowledge of John Arnold funding this and who John Arnold was. And I think that's probably true. But that misunderstands how propaganda really works. John Arnold doesn't have to exert day-to-day editorial control over segment producers or journalists if he can skew the entire frame of the series.
Of course.
If the entire frame of the series is pensions are bankrupting states, then you don't have to tell any of the individual reporters exactly what to do. You've already framed it for them.
Right, and I'd like to know the reporter who gets the assignment, hey, do you want to work on this pension peril program? No, pensions aren't in peril. I think I'm going to go do a different segment. I mean, you're right. I mean, it's self-selecting from the beginning. No reporter's going to show up with a story that says, hey, you know what? This whole series that we're doing, it doesn't make any sense. That person's just not going to work on it. I mean, anybody who works in production of any type whatsoever knows how that works. And we also know that, the reporter's not sitting there. He doesn't have editorial control at the end of the day. We know that this has got to be with a producer who undoubtedly is involved, who does know who's funding the thing, who does know what the initial agenda was. And if they could go out and find funding for this storyline, then they wouldn't have had to get all of their funding from one source that also coincidentally happened to be doing this on a political level. I mean, there's absolutely no justification and no mitigation of just how absurd this is. And this isn't the first. I mean, there's a real problem, it seems to me, and you touched upon this dynamic that's happening with PBS, and it's been going on for some time. And, I think, you see it in other shows as well, but the reliance on corporations inevitably is hugely problematic, and it's done so in a way that is opaque. I mean, at the very least, when you watch one of the major broadcast networks, you know who's funding it, and so you have the opportunity to in some way, take a measure, but. All you do is see these lists of foundations, and you just assume these are all just, charitable giving, and they just dump a bunch of money and walk away. I didn't even realize that they could have segments on the news that had earmarked money. I didn't even realize that could happen.
Well, you didn't realize that because, of course, when you go to PBS's website and you read the rules explicitly say that's not allowed. I mean, it's actually the reading through the rules it's amazing. I mean, they offer up examples of what's not allowed, and they offer up as one example. They say, in terms of direct funding, they say for instance, a Jewish social welfare organization cannot fund essentially reporting on let's say the Nazis. The idea is that it's too direct a connection, that a Jewish social welfare organization can fund a general journalism grant, but can't specifically fund to an area of interest that it is particularly interested in.
Wow.
So it has a standard that says, at least officially, that, and because this is not a liberal or conservative issue, in the sense that they're saying, look, it's not about whether we agree or you agree with the particular cause. It's that the political cause of an interest group without a judgment on that political cause cannot be funding journalism that is presented as dispassionate, impartial journalism. It makes sense.
And we know there's a lot of controversy around whether or not the Nazis were bad or not, and so you don't want anybody tainting that. I mean that example seems to me to be that's saying, like, we really realize how radioactive this is, to go from a Jewish social organization not funding anything about Nazis to going from a guy who specifically set out as what appears to be his one sort of like contribution to public life at this point in cutting public pensions to funding directly these segments that's a huge, huge leap. So, all right. So this story comes out, and I think it came out just a day or two before we went on vacation here, and I'm like, we got to have this because this is This is unbelievable. Well, it seems that PBS responded, at least at first, sort of as a joke, but then ultimately they realized that this was very tenuous for them.
Yeah, well, what happened was they first reacted with the kind of these blanket attacks, and Arnold too. Oh, this article's incendiary. It's not true. It's inaccurate. I love that. It's always the response. It's inaccurate, but we're going to offer up no details to prove that it's actually inaccurate. And then over the course of the next 36 hours, PBS at one point sent out to its viewers who were emailing and calling. They sent out a letter saying that they're going to continue with the show. And then what happened was a number of local PBS stations put out statements saying they're very concerned about this. The Arizona Public Broadcasting System, the Oregon Public Broadcasting System, and that's when PBS National decided to finally make a move. And by Friday afternoon, they made an announcment that they were returning John Arnold's $3.5 million. Now, I would say it's for me as a journalist, it's kind of, I was in shock that it was kind of a textbook example of, in a sense, what's supposed to happen in journalism. You break a story, you show wrongdoing, and an institution reacts. And I think there's some good news in that, in the sense that PBS clearly has corporate control issues, but it still has a brand that is, at least image-wise, tied to the public. And so I think the executives at PBS said, look, this fundamentally now threatens our brand. It's become so high profile that it threatens our brand. And so out of self-interest rather than principle, we've got to respond. And so they sent the $3.5 million back. My problem with the way they reacted was they're still insisting, unfortunately, that this was just a perception problem as opposed to an actual conflict, that it just looks bad, but it's not really bad. And I think that raises the question, what else are they defending? I think what their reaction says is, look, we'll concede this one because we were humiliated, but we need to put out an argument right now when we concede this that limits the damage and that doesn't box us in for all the other shady deals that we're probably involved in that the public doesn't even know about.
Right. Well, I mean, there's two takeaways here. I mean, first off is I don't even think it's enough, frankly, that they are just returning the money. They should have a segment on their news hour saying, we want you to know that information that we gave you was bought and paid for by someone who has a huge political stake in this. And I think on some level they're obligated to do another round of reporting basically on the validity of that entire narrative that they were pushing, A. And then B, there's that broader issue you're talking about. What are the other deals? I mean, this is the one that you caught through your reporting. I mean, where is the corporate, or the I should say the institution-wide review of any deals like this and their process for dealing with this stuff? Because they didn't just have this problem. They seem to me had a massive breakdown, a systemic breakdown in the way that they're supposed to go about doing business. And then lastly,
absolutely, and what they need is an independent. I mean, this is where Congress, for instance, is supposed to act, but that goes back to the political question. Look, there are forces in Congress that like what's going on at PBS. I mean, you hear a lot about, the conservatives, they used to bash PBS. That sort of died down a little bit because I think a lot of folks on the right, and frankly, that includes folks in the Democratic Party as well, certainly some of them, they like what they have. I mean,
sure.
What they have is a PBS that presents, in many cases, radical conservative ideas as public broadcasting without any disclosure of who's funding it. And they get that because they underfund it. So if you're a congressperson who hates police officers, firefighters, teachers, and wants to cut their pensions, and you're sitting there on the committee that oversees PBS, you're looking at this and saying, well, look, they got busted. That's too bad for John Arnold, who I like and who I want to help his campaign and the like. But I don't have a problem with this because the system right now incentivizes this kind of thing to happen. And so why would I want to expose it and stop it? That's the real fundamental problem here. One thing I will say is that at least the ombudsman of PBS and the ombudsman of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting both weighed in, and they both said that this was outrageous. In fact, the head of the Corporation of Public Broadcasting, the ombudsman there, said that he couldn't even believe that the contracts between grant makers and PBS stations are still completely don't have to be disclosed. They can
Right.
be kept secret. He couldn't believe that, and that's the way it is.
Well, and so what about WNET? I mean, it sounds like, and if I have this right, they were the ones who sort of initiated this deal. They were the essentially the initial producers. What has been the response from WNET, or are they not, or are they not distinct from PBS in this instance?
Yeah, well, it's a fair question, and here's the thing: is that to understand PBS is a network of public broadcasting stations that pay member fees to an umbrella organization. There are three major PBS affiliate stations: WNET, WGBH in Boston, and WETA in DC, that produce the lion's share of the national programming that you then see on smaller local PBS stations. Like I see mostly, or certainly a lot of WNET, WGBH, and WETA productions out here in Denver on my local PBS station. So PBS, effectively, the umbrella organization, is the distributor of the content that primarily those three PBS stations create. So when WNET responds, it's effectively PBS responding as well. It's the same thing. And there's been controversy. It's important to put this in context. WNET is the station that was at the center of the controversy around the documentary Citizen Coke. And for folks who don't know about that, it's a long story that the New Yorker covered, but effectively, here's what happened. Alex Gibney, the great director, he had a contract to do a film documentary for WNET about Park Avenue, was called, and it ultimately came out, and it dealt with wealth inequality, and it touched on David Koch, one of the Koch brothers. And in advance of that film coming out, WNET panicked that their board member at the time, David Koch, would freak out. And so they gave Koch an advanced screening of the documentary, and they let him attach a response to Alex's film. And they also let Chuck Schumer, the Democratic senator who was treated very critically in that film, also attach a response. And then what ended up also happening because of all of this, because WNET was so afraid of the retribution they'd face from David Koch in anger that they even aired the Gibney film, they ended up killing a film that they had already previously commissioned about the Koch brothers, called Citizen Coke. They ended up killing it. They ended up saying, we're not going to air it, out of fear of invoking the ire of their own board member, David Koch. So there's been all sorts of controversies at this particular station.
Wow. Well, it's a great story. And so is it basically, I mean, is it done now? I mean, insofar as, at least in this limited area, they've given back the money. Are they planning to do anything else in this regard, or are they just trying to get it past them?
Well, they gave back the money. They said they're not going to continue the series in its current form. They said they're going to continue to report on pensions, which by the way, I think they should. As far as I know, nobody's been fired. There hasn't been any informal investigation, although who knows? It's an opaque organization. I think we're going to see some more stories. I'm working on another story right now about another controversy within the PBS system. And I want to be clear. Some people say, well, are you picking on PBS? Well, it's not that big a deal. Look, PBS is a huge brand. Yeah. It may not. The NewsHour gets what I think at the last rate 1 million viewers a night. I mean, that's not enormous, but that's real. That's serious. And I think that we have to take seriously the idea that if PBS is a voice that is considered impartial in a very noisy media space where people have trouble trusting, and rightly so, trusting the information they get, that the reason PBS is able to raise this kind of money is because the people like John Arnold, who are not stupid people, see that it is a powerful brand to launder their ideas. And that's why we have to take this seriously.
I think you're absolutely right about that. I really appreciate the work you did on this piece, and thank you so much for coming on, David Sirota.
Thanks so much, Sam. Great to talk to you.